Okay, back. All right, Christianity. Into this scenario came a new religion that was destined to change things quite a bit, at least change things in the West. Here in Judea, Judea had been conquered, but the people of Judea were very, very restless under Roman rule. It felt like that, hey, we should not have to be under the authority of Rome. But some of them liked Roman rule and some of them didn't. But due to discontent, a whole lot of Jews had scattered all over this part of the world, North Africa and Europe, and what they did not realize was that this was paving the way for the spread of Christianity. Now, the Jews, as they scattered, they would set up their synagogues. They would not try to convert their neighbors, but they would tell their neighbors, we believe, unlike you, we believe there's only one God, and we believe that God is going to send a Messiah someday, and this Messiah is going to straighten out the whole world, and we also don't believe in eating pork. We don't believe it's right to commit adultery. We don't believe it's right to steal. We believe that our God sees this stuff and judges us for this stuff, so we try to abstain from it. Now, they spread this to their neighbors, their Gentile neighbors, everywhere they went. Now, this was to greatly enhance the spread of Christianity because it let the whole world become aware of a group of people who only believed in one God and who believed the Messiah was coming. Into this scenario stepped Jesus of Nazareth. You may know the story, born in a stable, born in a barn. And for the first 30 years of his life, it's largely unknown. Some people say he went to India during those years. Some say he went to Great Britain, but we don't know for real sure. We might someday find records that we've lost. Anyway, for 3 years he began his public ministry, and those 3 years are recorded by men who followed him, Matthew and Mark and Luke and John. Matthew was one of his disciples, Mark also. Luke was a Gentile follower, converted Gentile who came along later. And John was one of his closest disciples, but they wrote about him. And these writings contain what we know about his life as his public ministry. Then he was crucified on a charge of that he was leading an insurrection against Rome, or on a charge that he was dangerous, or a charge that he was perverting the nation, and also on a charge that he claimed to be the Son of God, which was blasphemy among the Jews, unless it turned out to be true. But anyway, he was crucified. Now, this part of the story, folk, again, if you think this is fetched, I'm not going to apologize for saying it. Every story you get from the ancient world is fetched. His followers claimed he rose again. 500 persons at least saw him ascend into heaven, and most of these people lived for quite a long time afterward. Whether or not you believe he has rose again, I don't want to discuss it here. This is not the forum to discuss whether he did, but one point I want to make is that his followers have believed that, and that was to change the whole course of Western history, and ultimately the whole course of world history. But anyway, at first his religion was only among his Jewish followers. They tried to convert the Jews, but they would send out missionaries, because Jesus told them as the last words before he went into heaven, go to all the world. Well, the missionaries would go at first to synagogues. But the Jewish people who went to the synagogue every Saturday, which is Sabbath, most of them didn't believe that Jesus was Messiah. And finally, Paul of Tarsus decided he was tired of this, said, okay, you Jews won't believe, but we're going to go to the Gentiles. So Paul of Tarsus went for two things. Number one, bringing the message to the people who were not Jews, otherwise called Gentiles. Folk, every group of people there's us and there's other people. And in case of the Greeks, they called other people barbarians. Anyone who was not Greek was barbarian. Among the Jews, anyone who was not Jew was a Gentile. Anyway, Paul said, I'm going to preach the message now to the Gentiles. And the Gentiles mostly eventually accepted it. More so than the Jews ever did. Well, at first, the religion was not noticed. But then, in 64, it caught the attention of the Roman Emperor Nero, who tried to eliminate a persecution. For the next 300 or so years, Christianity had to endure persecution, as well as battles from all kinds of doctrines that crept in, Gnosticism, donationism. I mean, I could name several of them, Montanism. And again, Christianity has had a tendency to divide itself. But eventually, after all attempts to eradicate it failed, you had a Roman emperor, at the last, a Roman emperor named Diocletian, who made a determined effort. He was going to rid the world of Christianity, and he made a really hard effort to do so, and he failed, by any account. He failed. So then the next emperor after Diocletian, Constantine, who might have been secretly a Christian anyway, converted. Constantine became a Christian, the first Christian emperor. And after him, all the emperors were Christian except for one, Julian. He's called Julian the Apostate. But other than that, all the emperors after him were Christian. So Christianity went from being a small sect of unheard of, for a while even meeting in the tombs. I mean, they would meet in the catacombs, burial places underneath the city of Rome. They went from being a secret organization to the chief religion of the empire, and eventually became the official religion of the empire, and then it eventually became, for all purposes, the only religion of the empire. Now, there is the issue of what changes were made as a result of Christianity. Number one change was the practice of exposing babies largely stopped. And recently I read where that the real reason that Christianity was hated was because they would try to get these babies that had been left out in the woods to be devoured, and they would sneak out and then try to rear up these babies, and the Romans hated them for this, not realizing these babies were really much needed. But they stopped the practice of exposing babies, as well as greatly curbed the practice of abortion, which the Catholic Church has been against from that day to this. Then they also stopped most political assassinations. For many years after, for the next 1,000 years, as political assassinations would become very, very rare. Unlike before, you heard that political assassination was the norm. Christianity largely stopped that. I read an article one time many years ago on all the influences, all the things that Christianity stopped. They stopped the worship of the emperor, and eventually stopped slavery. They stopped the practice of crucifixion. You know, in a really brutal way of executing a person. Christianity largely stopped that, but they also largely stopped the practice of slavery. Slavery, though, was to make a comeback when Europeans drifted into Africa. That's an unfortunate consequence of Europeans scattering out. Now, folk, there are persons who will say that Christianity destroyed the Roman Empire. Maybe I'd agree with that. When I was in the 3rd grade, that young, even in the 2nd grade, I learned that the best way to clean out my desk was to take everything in it out and then put it back in. Best way to clean out a closet, take everything in the closet out. I mean everything, clean the closet, then clean everything, put it back in neatly and orderly. Some of you might know what I'm talking about. What does this have to do with Christianity? The best way to clean up Europe was to destroy it. First of all, it was a slave society, and it was an emperor worshiping society. This had to be destroyed. If you really want to say that Christianity destroyed the Roman Empire, you have to turn around and say, well, how come it was the Western Europeans who exploded out of their environment and invented the automobile, the airplane, the light bulb, the computer, the gas heater, the Franklin stove? You have to explain it, folk. Yes, Christianity might have destroyed the Roman Empire. Yes, the Roman Empire really needed to be destroyed. It had some problems. But anyway, now, Paul is also remembered for another thing. He wrote the letters. I mean, he was put in prison for a while. And he wrote letters to the to other Christians, and these letters have become the foundation of Christian faith. And I want to sum up in one word what these letters say. In one word, it's just believe. I'll leave it at that. I mean, he wrote several letters, including the book of Romans, Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, Colossians, so on and so forth. But in one word, it's believe. All right. Now, why did Christianity triumph? Well, one reason, it seems like the old gods seem to have become impotent. Folk, again, this might belong more in a theology class, but there is, the oracles. I mentioned how the Greek oracle at Delphi all of a sudden went silent. If the whole thing was totally fake, they could have kept right on faking it. The oracles would not answer them anymore. This also, now this is something you won't see, but you can research and you can find. Look, there was an earthquake that just seemed to affect only the pagan temples, and the earthquake shook the pagan temples apart, and nothing else. I mean, you might find this fetched and hard to believe, but it's in the record, folk. But if that weren't enough, see, the Romans used to credit their gods with their victors, but then it was found out that sometimes they would worship and do sacrifice to their gods and still lose. This hurt them. But as their old gods became less and less, seemingly less impotent, more and more impotent, they started worshiping Isis from Egypt. And again, Isis is making a big comeback for another reason. But they started worshiping Isis, and they would start worshiping the mystery religions. But ultimately, Christianity was destined to get rid of all the mystery religions and ISIS too, and put ISIS in the background. Or if you might say, force ISIS to go underground for a long time. Now, here's something else. Christians live longer than other people. This has been noticed in recent times, where a Christian, or maybe a believer, is more likely than a non-believer to recover from cancer, or more likely to live. But in those days, it was noticeably longer. Christians did not engage in the parties I talked about earlier, the extreme, drunken, gluttonous parties. The average Roman lived 22 years. Christians lived an average of almost 60 years. The difference was noticeable. Partly because Christians did not engage, and also when the plagues came, and they had a problem with plagues, Christians would stay there and help. Now, this did not apply to the Black Death in the 1300s. That's when even the priests would run like crazy. But when the plagues came, and it's known that half the people who suffered from plague, if they were just kept warm and kept being given water and kept being fed, if people would tend to their needs, half of them would survive. And once you had survived the plague, you were immune. Then you could help others survive. Only Christians would stay around and help people survive the plagues. Other people would flee. And this did a lot to help influence the spread of Christianity. Also, Christianity promised a happy afterlife for its followers, something that the mystery religions did not tend to promise, and also something that the pagan religions did not promise at all. They promised a happy afterlife for the believers. Christians, I've mentioned before, they took in anybody who would join, whether your background was criminal, uneducated, poverty, the prostitute, the undesirable, people other people didn't want. Christianity took them in for the most part. And all this led to the rise of Christianity. All right. I'm going to have to move pretty fast. Let's see, 10, 12, okay. Now, fall of the Roman Empire. Rome went through a period of some 50 years where they had 24 emperors, and except for one old man who was already in his 80s when he got to be emperor, it only lasted a few months, they all were killed. Rome killed its emperors like crazy, and this went on until finally Diocletian took over. Diocletian was a general. He took over by brute force, so he used his army to take over, and he brought some order to the empire. He divided the empire into 4 sections, which his next emperor was destined to complete. But one of these sections, this right here, was ruled by a man named Constantine, who was the father of the first Christian. Now, unfortunately, though, without going into more detail, Diocletian passed a law that every man must be in a profession as father. So if your father was a soldier, you had to become a soldier whether you wanted to or not. If your father were a blacksmith, you had to become a blacksmith. There was nothing he could have done I could agree with less. I mean, I believe that, hey, if he had just simply said, each man chooses a profession, and if you can't do the job, you'll find something else you can do, but just choose your own profession, folk. Well, he also tried to regulate prices and regulate wages. Again, I would like to go back in time and say, Mr. Diocletian, Your Majesty, let the market set prices, let the market set wages. Oh, but some people won't get paid enough and some get paid too much. Let it be. It will all work itself out. Let the market decide who goes into what profession. Well, anyway, he made these changes. Unlike the other emperors, though, he didn't die in office. He retired and went to his estate. Particularly when his attempt to wipe out Christianity failed. And he saw that he was not going to be able to wipe it out. And in part because Constantine, the father of the man who became the next emperor, the father of Constantine would not follow his orders to wipe. So Christianity was not persecuted in this part of the empire right here. That was one reason that Diocletian failed to wipe it out. But also, even in the places where his laws were enforced, he did not eradicate it. The next emperor after Diocletian retired was Constantine. Constantine got to be emperor after a fight. Constantine started out as a pagan, like his father was, even though he seems to have had a lot of sympathy for the Christians for some reason. But Constantine was about to go into battle one night, where he was going to go into battle the following day, but that night he had a dream. In his dream, he saw a cross in heaven, and on the cross were the Latin words that said, "By this sign conquer." He woke up, and he had every one of his soldiers put a cross on their shields and a cross on their breastplates. The cross across their chest. Then, this was done rather quickly. Then he went into battle. Now, folk, it seemed like this was committing political suicide. I mean, no more than 10% of the empire was Christian. For him to do this, but it worked. I recall over here, my high school football coach during a game when the assistant coach made a remark that a certain play should not have been called. The play gained a lot of yardage for us, but the assistant coach, the play shouldn't have called. The head coach said, any play that works was a good call. Even if it was a lousy call. If it worked, it was a good call. Whatever. Anyway, I've spent the rest of my life debating that. Whatever. Becoming Christian seems to have been a good call because it worked. So Constantine became the emperor. He immediately had his statues removed from the temples. He stopped the emperor worship because before this time, all the emperors demanded that they be worshipped. He stopped emperor worship. Now, he also divided the empire, even as the predecessor had, and he kept his predecessor's laws about every man had to become what his father was. He kept those laws in place. But he decided things were just a little bit too decadent in Rome, so he moved the capital from Rome to Constantinople, named after himself. He named the city after himself. Constantinople was located where the Black Sea joins the Mediterranean. And this was eventually to lead to the empire dividing. The empire that he founded over here was eventually called, it became the Ottoman Empire, as shown on a map, but it became the Byzantine Empire first. The Byzantine Empire was destined to last 1,000 years before eventually it succumbed to the Ottoman. The Turkish people conquered it. But anyway, the move here was designed, among other things, to make it cheaper for him to fight these Persians. The Persian Empire started to revive about this time, and like I say, the wars that they fought against Persia were to last about 300 or 400 years. And they were to do a lot to bring down the Roman Empire. Anyway, the empire was now Christian. Time went on. Now, another problem arose. Barbarian people, uncivilized people, by any accounts of it, we call them Germans, began to come in and invade. Now, this is something that was not going on in America 50 years ago when I wrote the paper 53 years ago. But, to make a long story short, the Romans eventually allowed these German people to come in. And they destroyed the Roman Empire. Check the record, folks. It's in the records. How much does that apply to the United States today? Time will tell. All right, now why did the Romans allow the Germans in? Okay, here is something else that happened that we cannot imagine. One day, the Roman officials heard a rumor that there were hundreds of thousands of people coming in from over the horizon. We call them the Huns. The Huns came from what is today Mongolia. The Mongolians have come out of Mongolia in waves. The Finns, the Magyars, the Huns, the Bulgars, and ultimately the Ottomans, the Turks, all started out in Mongolia. But this right now that we're talking about the Huns, they were led by a man named Attila the Hun. Now, why did they leave Mongolia? Because conditions in Mongolia become so bad. I mean, Mongolia is a dry land, where the people there have lots and lots of babies, but it's a very dry land otherwise. And the people of Mongolia drove out the Huns, so basically the Huns lost. So they had to go and find a new territory. So they headed straight west, and they threatened both the Germans and the Romans. Attila the Hun said, I was sent by God because of you people's sins, and he believed he was indestructible. Well, one day, the Germans and Romans got together, and they defeated Attila the Hun in battle. And Attila the Hun had resigned himself to his fate, but the Roman general thought to himself, wait a minute, I don't want to wipe out these Huns because I need them. I can't defeat the Germans. So he had his men open up a big hole in the line around. They were surrounding the Huns, but he had his men open a big hole, and the Huns realized, hey, there's nobody here, so they all escaped, including Attila. The purpose was to use Attila the Hun later to fight against the Germans, who are right now helping him out. So Attila was defeated. Attila went on down into Italy, but there Pope Leo persuaded him to not attack Rome. Attila then went on to settle down in what is today Hungary, and that's where we get the nation of Hungary. Comes to the Huns. But Attila the Hun had done irreparable damage. He would go into a town and slaughter the daylights out of that town, and then move on to the next town and start it. Now, there was one city that said, we're not going to open up the gates to you. Attila stayed around that city for a month and then moved on to an easier town. One king in this area committed suicide rather than fight him. He realized he didn't have a chance to win. And yet, folk, Attila the Hun underneath proved to be a coward. If they had just stood up to him with more firmness, I believe they could have, well, they eventually whipped him, but I believe they could have whipped him sooner than they did before he did all the damage. Eventually, somebody did stand up to him, and he eventually did put him in. But he had done more damage than, let's see, Attila the Hun. He was called the scourge of God in a lot of places. But anyway, because of the Huns, the Romans let the Germans in, and the Germans did a lot of damage to the Roman Empire. Now, the barbaric people, the Germans, they were known as, among other things, the Angles, the Saxons, the Jutes. They went to England. I'll talk more about this when we come to chapter 12. But then there was the Goths, the Ostrogoths. The Visigoths went to Spain. The Ostrogoths went to Italy. To make a long story short, they were to completely change the political scene of Italy. The Romans disappeared from the Italian scene. And Latin ceased to be the language of the people of Italy, and instead Latin was replaced by Italian. Italian has a lot of Latin words, but it's also a mixture of the Germanic language and the original Latin. But basically, the Western world went into a period of time we used to call the Dark Ages, when learning largely was wiped out, where we have very few written records, when very few men learned how to read, civilization declined, the empire fragmented, and Europe greatly declined. This decline was to last for, several hundred years. Eventually, we'll come to chapter 12 and find out that Europe had a rebirth after that, a renaissance. Then Europe had a reformation, then Europe went on to invent a steam engine, the Enlightenment was to come about, and Europe was destined to go and explode and expand out and overspread the whole globe. But that was to come later. But for right now, we're going to have to leave Europe in a state of darkness. Now, the issue is, why did Rome fall? There have been all kinds of stories put out. What was wrong with Rome? It is known that Romans used lead plates, lead cups, lead drinking cups, lead spoons, and lead pipes. Now, my dad worked at construction for a while, and in those days they would use lead to seal pipes, and still do. Solder is made a lot out of lead. Lead is used, and Dad would bring the lead home, and we kids would put this lead in tin cans and mill it down and put it in clay molds and make chess pieces or something. Don't do this, folk. Don't ask me how we got away with it. Maybe it was sheer innocence. We got away with it. It could have led to lead poisoning. And I know a woman who got poisoned by lead one time and was sick for maybe 8 or 10 years. It could have been disastrous. But anyway, it's believed by some that lead, by the way, lead-based paints. I moved into a house when I had lead-based paint, but I painted over it with paint. It was not lead-based. Oh yes, when I was a kid, we had a lot of lead in our gasoline. Leaded gasoline is now alcohol. Even your older cars are not allowed to have it anymore. No lead. But anyway, lead has been a scourge to mankind. We know that. But again, you cannot prove that lead did it. There has been, that there was decline in morality. What you can prove, though, and this I've already mentioned, there was a population decline. Why? The population went from 50 million to 10. Don't do like one girl said many years ago, the people moved from city to country. No, I'm talking about a population decline of the whole empire. And it wasn't caused by them moving from city to country. It was caused by simply they died off without having babies to replace them. They largely stopped having babies. And part of that might have been that because their men and women did not like each other. Again, we don't know exactly why that is. In fact, one author says, why did Rome fall? We may never know. But one of the problems they had, folks, that our own founding fathers tried to eradicate, the problem of what does an office mean? Now, if you study Roman history, you had the office of tribune. The office of tribune they were strong for a while, then they faded out in importance. It'd be like joining the army. In today's army, the general is top, but then in the next generation, the colonel might be on top, and the generals take a back seat. Then the captain would even rise higher than a colonel, and the generals get even lower. I mean, I'm speaking maybe facetiously, but an army where you didn't define what an office was. In our Constitution, it says the president shall have power. The Congress shall have power. The president is elected every 4 years, on the second Tuesday of November, every fourth year. It's all written down. They did not have such a constitution. So really, they didn't have a way to pick their leaders. This led to numerous civil wars. And the wars are known to be destructive because I've already mentioned how that people would come home from the wars and find their wives taken up with another man, partly, or of course, sometimes the soldiers still took up with another woman while they were out. And what I can tell you, when I was in the army, one of my buddies who was in the same outfit with me got caught pitch drunk. And his sergeant threatened to tell us, oh, please. He said, don't tell my wife. Oh, I beg him, don't tell my wife. He didn't. He was nice enough about it, but he didn't want his wife to find out. He didn't want his church to find out either. But these men would get away from their families and do things that they otherwise would not do. And then the women would get away from their husbands, do things that they might otherwise not do. This was even more true in Roman times, perhaps, than it is today. Today we have instant communications, which they did not have. They'd send their husbands off to war for women, and then they might go a year or two without hearing from them.